And then I was contacted later after that by Dr. John Mack to represent him. What
year were you contacted by him?
1994. I was contacted in 94 by John Mack to represent him at Harvard, because I'd graduated from the college and the law school and had gone to do my master's and PhD work at Harvard. And so he figured that, we'd kind of wave the school tie at them and get them to lay off him, So that's the next kind of major event that I was engaged in. And John and I had gone to see Lawrence Rockefeller, and Rockefeller had agreed to finance an entire grand rounds at Harvard to present all of the information and evidence to them. And so I was actually in the position of interviewing virtually everybody in the field on behalf of Dr. John Mack to prepare them as witnesses to be part of this grand rounds at Harvard in 1994.
So you interviewed the people that were in his abduction book? The people that
well, I met some of those people, yeah. But I also interviewed all the major researchers. I got to meet Stanton Friedman. I got to meet Bud Hopkins. I got to meet David Jacobs. I got to meet virtually everybody. I got to meet Stephen Greer. I got to meet Linda Moulton Howe. I got to meet all the folks that were researchers, and then I got to meet all kinds of the direct experiencers, because I also became legal counsel for the Project for Extraordinary Experience Research. That's the peer group that John Mack put together in Cambridge. So I got to meet the people in that context. And so that's why Stephen Greer ended up asking me in 2001 to be legal counsel for the Disclosure Project. And I was legal counsel for the Disclosure Project for 20 years. So I got to meet a lot more people in vetting the witnesses that we were going to present at the National Press Club in 2001.
Yeah. So going back to John Mack, when he first reached out to you, what was he wanted you to represent him for the stuff that Harvard was coming down on him for
Yes.
for the research that he was doing?
That's right.
What did you guys end up doing when you first met with him, and how did you approach that case with him?
Well, it was interesting. I actually got contacted initially by Ron Robertson. Ron Robertson is John Mack's best friend. He was his best man for him and Sally at their wedding and everything. And he was out in Santa Barbara, and I was teaching at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And Ron Robertson contacted me. He was the head of the art department at the Santa Barbara City College. And he had come to a number of my lectures on the Iran-Contra case and the Karen Silkwood case and 3 Mile Island case and other cases that we had done. And so he was kind of a follower of the Christic Institute at the time. So he called me and asked me to come and see him, and then asked me, what I thought about the UFO issue. And I told him I thought it was extraordinarily important. It was probably one of the most important public policy issues that one could be involved in. And he said, well, look, I should tell you that my best friend, John Mack, has just been dragged up in front of this kind of tribunal at Harvard University that's completely secret right now, but that they're excoriating him for having written this book about his interviews with people who held sincere beliefs that they'd had direct contact with extraterrestrial spacecraft, et cetera. And I said, would you be willing to take a call from John and consider representing him? And I said, yes, absolutely. So John called me, had me fly to Cambridge, and we sat down to talk about this. And we looked into it, and this was not an AAUP panel. It was not an Association of American University Professors authorized panel of any kind. It was just this kind of rump gathering that they'd put together. And then I found out that what had happened is that the United States Air Force and the Defense Department and the Central Intelligence Agency have been engaged for decades in a covert program of trying to smear people inside the military or inside government offices who tried to actually do anything about the UFO issue. Right. And what had happened is that one of the first things they would do, if a high-ranking officer insisted upon filing an official UFO report, one of the first things they would do is order him to go get a psychiatric exam, which is not a career builder, in the military. And so that a few of these guys who had actually pushed all the way through and insisted upon filing an official report, for example, Colonel Arnoldson was the commander at the Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana back in 1968, when the UFO came up over the Minuteman site and shut off all 10 of the Minuteman missiles. And Arnie Arnoldson was the guy that called NORAD about it and said, that we've got this the craft of some sort that's come up over our site and has closed off all of our missiles. And they said, are you trying to file a UFO report? And he said, yes, I am. And they said, well, that's interesting because both the Minuteman site to your west and to your east have both reported the same thing. They've had their missiles shut off too, which people don't know about, don't talk about. But I talked to Colonel Arnoldson. But it was fellows like that who insisted upon going forward that would be ordered to get a psychiatric exam. And so a number of them had been sent to Harvard Medical School to get this kind of top-level psychiatric exam. And John Mack, being the chairman of the department, was actually tasked to do that. So he did that, and as he told me later, he said, I did all the interviews with them and did all the tests.
This wasn't by choice.
No. They were ordered to do it. And so when John said,
I mean him, but it wasn't his choice to interview these people.
Well, no, they were sent there to be tested. And my guess is that he, as the chairman of the department, had some discretion in who would be assigned to actually do the exams, and so he chose to do those.
Do you know if before he started interviewing these people, these military people, if he had any sort of interest in this topic before that?
No, he did not.
Okay,
he did not. He had no. He assumed it was all nutty, actually, and he actually suspected that these guys had something wrong with them. And he did the interviews, and then he said, but each one of them tested out to be within the normal parameters of normalcy, and yet they had this story that they kept insisting upon going forward with, and they felt compelled to talk about it. And were ordered to be silent about it. And so he actually called his mother. John, who was like, I don't know, probably 60 years old at that time, but he called his mother, who was like 90 years old, and tells her about this. And she said, oh, well, you should go see the Hopkins boy. They were the family friends. The Mack family were family friends with the Hopkins family. And she said the Hopkins boy has been interviewing a lot of people who believe that they've seen these UFOs or had direct contact with the pilots or the occupants. And so he ended up calling Bud Hopkins and getting to talk to Bud, and Bud sent some other people to him. Police officers and, teachers and lawyers and librarians, people who were in kind of positions in the community that it would not have been in their interest to make up something like that. And so he started interviewing them. And as he started interviewing them, he got so fascinated by the stories that he began actually conducting like an investigation. What he would do is he never hypnotized. John never hypnotized anybody. He didn't want to do that.
He never did?
No, he did not. What he does is he did a thing called holotropic breathing. Holotropic breathing was a method that was developed by Stanislav Grof to actually get people super relaxed, and they would do it's sort of like Hindu breathing through the different nose things, and they would get into a kind of an elevated state of consciousness and get very, very relaxed, and that was the key for them to remember things, that any kind of anxiety that they had that was blocking any of their memory. So he would do the holotropic breathing and interview the people, and what he would do is he would actually start asking them kind of ancillary questions. They would tell what was happening. They say, "Okay, now are you you're where?" They say, "Well, I'm inside some kind of a room. I'm on this table, and I'm getting examined." And he said, "Now, will you look around a little bit? Tell us, what do you see?" And then he would have them describe like the equipment in the room. What type of equipment do you see? What does it look like? And he would get like details of some of the stuff that they were seeing. So that when he had another person who was in a similar situation, he would ask them things that nobody would have ever asked him about, but like particular little details about what was happening, and it started being correlating. And so he started to suspect that this was something that was extraordinarily strange because it seemed like it was real, what was happening to them. And so he wrote an article. He wrote an article for the New England Journal of Medicine.
How many people had stories that were very similar and what kind of objects did they talk about seeing?
They would talk about some of the instruments, for example, that were being used to examine them. He would ask them to describe in detail what the instruments looked like. Was there any kind of equipment in the room? What kind? Did you see any kind of navigation equipment in there? Any kind of computers? What did you see? And they would describe in some detail some of the stuff that they were seeing.
I had a guy on here named Randall Nickerson.
Yeah, Randy. Yeah, Nickerson.
He explained to me something about some sort of like pole or stick.
Yeah. It was a rod.
A rod.
There's a rod. That a number of them reported having them. It was usually the tall grays, they call them, that had this rod, and that they would it seemed to actually give them control over people. Actually, it was it seemed to amp up kind of their telepathic capacities, which were quite considerable to begin with. But it was like that. So John ended up sending in this report that he did for an article for the New England Journal of Medicine, and after several days, it got sent back to him with a note saying they weren't going to publish this. Well, he was kind of taken aback by this. He's the chairman of the Department of Clinical Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. This is a very professional piece. So he decided what he would do is he would beef it up. He would put in more footnotes and more details of the stuff to make it really full-scale professional. And then he sent it back to him. And within 2 days, the executive assistant for Arnold Relman, who was the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, sent his executive assistant back to Harvard to go into the office of John and hand it back to him and to tell him to note that it had not been opened. And they weren't going to open it, and they weren't going to even consider publishing it. And John got upset about it, and so John called a publisher. He'd won the Pulitzer Prize already, for writing Lawrence of Arabia, the T.E. Lawrence thing, the psychobiography. And so he contacted a publisher, and the publisher agreed to write it, to print it, and it was published. And then, within a couple days of it hitting the stands, the dean of the medical school came in and said, "John, I hear that you've published a new book." And he said, "Yes." He said, "Well, this is a very interesting topic. Why don't you come by, and let's talk about this. It's very interesting." And then he said, "Look, and as long as you and I are going to be talking about it, why don't we invite some of the other faculty people to come on over who might be interested in this?" So John was excited about this. John thought that was a cool idea. So he was going to. He went to where the assigned place was to go and meet the dean, and he comes into the room, and here's this tribunal sitting there. That there is not only the dean himself, but it turns out that Arnold Relman, the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine, was chairing the committee. And then there was the legal counsel for Harvard University sitting there. And then there were 3 other professors, all of whom John thought were people who really didn't like him for some reason in the faculty. He had some experience with them. And they were all there, and they began to excoriate him. For besmirching the name of Harvard University, writing about this ridiculous thing, that it was clear that these people were mentally ill, and that if he had written an article, about this weird mental illness, then that would have been okay. But he seemed to give the impression that he was attributing some sort of dimension of reality to this whole experience, and so he was taken completely aback by what they were doing. So he called his mother. again. And his mother said, well, why don't you just go to the family lawyer? They were a fairly wealthy family, and his father was a doctor and his grandfather was a doctor. They were kind of a wealthy family. And so he goes to the local lawyer in Boston, the family lawyer, and the lawyer says, oh, just give them anything they want. If they want the recordings of your sessions, did you bill them? Did they go get insurance? Were you doing this as a clinical treatment to them, or were you doing research? Just tell them whatever they want to know. And he was kind of surprised. He said he wasn't expecting that kind of advice. And then he checked and found out that the law firm, Ropes and Gray, was the lawyer for Harvard University.
Oh, no.
And he felt betrayed by the whole thing. And so he called his best friend, Ron Robertson.
Who called you?
Who ended up calling me. Say, why don't we get Danny and see if he's interested in helping you on this? And John said, oh, no, he did like the Iran-Contra case and the Big Silver. He's done all those other big cases. He probably wouldn't even be interested in this subject. That's why Ron Robertson called me, asked me to come to dinner and asked me, what do you think about this? And so that's how I got to be on the case. So I go with John to the next session of the tribunal, and we come in, we sit down, right? And there's Relman up there with all the dean of the medical school and the lawyer and all these guys. And so Relman just starts in trying to interrogate him. And so I said, well, excuse me. I said, excuse me here. I don't know. I didn't do the potted plant routine. that I'm not just a potted plant sitting here. I said, look, I don't know what the nature of this tribunal is. It's certainly not an AAUP convened tribunal. I said, but whatever the nature of it is, can you tell me? Are any of either one of the two following fact questions going to be at issue here? Number one, whether or not extraterrestrial life exists, and secondly, whether at least some of these sightings of the UFOs might actually be a vehicle from an extraterrestrial civilization. And Relman says, well, the two of them are absolutely going to be relevant. He said, and it's totally ridiculous to think that either one of those things could be true. That's what he says to me. 1994, Harvard University still says it's completely ridiculous to think that there would be life anywhere else in the universe. I mean, that's where they were. So I said to him, well, in that case, in the spirit of cooperation, let's just tell me, who is it that called the dean? And there was this big dead silence over the room. And he looked around like this, and the lawyer for Harvard University looks at him and goes like that, shakes her head no. And he says, well, I'm sorry, we're not at liberty to discuss that. And I said, oh, okay. I said, well, look, in the spirit of cooperation here, you said they asked a bunch of questions and he wasn't really able to answer the questions. So, what were the questions? Another big, long pause. He looked at the lawyer shook her head no, and he said, I'm sorry, we're not at liberty to discuss that. So I said, all right, well then look, let me just tell you in the spirit of openness that John and I have just spent the weekend with Lawrence Rockefeller, and he's agreed to finance a complete grand rounds here on this subject at Harvard University. That we'll bring in the chief investigator for the Federal Aviation Agency, we'll bring in military personnel, we'll bring in police officers and things that have filed these reports. And the lawyer for Harvard University just leaped to her feet and she said, absolutely not. She said, we're not going to allow this procedure to be turned into some kind of a circus, she said. And so I said, we've made the offer. We're perfectly willing to answer your questions and stuff, but we're going to present the witnesses to support these two fact questions that you think are at issue here. And so if, we're ready to proceed. And they said, no, we're not going to do any of that. So I said to John, that's it, John. We're out of here. This is not an official tribunal of any kind. You don't have to be here. So I reached down and kind of helped pick him up out of the chair and walked out on him, And so I went around doing all the interviews of all of these people that we could present. We just kept going straight forward saying, I kept saying, this is a great opportunity, to present to Harvard University what the evidence is and the information is that we have. So I had to have a local counsel because I was admitted in the Southern District of New York and in Washington, D.C., but I wasn't admitted in Massachusetts. So I went to Dershowitz, Al Dershowitz, who was one of my professors at Harvard, and said, because I had the course with him on psychiatry and the law, he and Stone, Professor Alan Stone. So I'd taken a year course in that at Harvard. And so I went to see him and I said, who should we have to be just local counsel for me here? So he recommended Harvey Silverglate. And Harvey was in the middle of a trial and he couldn't do it. So he recommends this young guy, Eric McLeish, who had just gotten into the bar in Massachusetts. And so he could just, be there to be local counsel. So we brought him on board. And then he right away started working at trying to figure out how to settle the case. To say, well, look, why don't we just do whatever they tell you to do? Why don't you just,
Right.
And I said, no, stop it. We're not going to do that. We're not going to turn over all the tape recordings of these things to them. I said, that we're going to do the grand rounds. And so he kept on figuring out, how to solve this thing and settle it and make him leave him alone. And John's wife was upset. Sally was really upset, because he was being ostracized, at Harvard. He wasn't invited to any of the social events anymore, and she wasn't getting invited to any of the women's things. And so she was getting really upset about what was happening to him. And it was all secret, because they kept saying, we want this kept secret, that we're doing this hearing. And I kept saying to myself, why the hell should we keep this secret? This is ridiculous. They don't have any right to be doing this. But so what I was doing is I was respecting John's wish to keep it secret. So what I did is I was reaching out to all these different potential witnesses to come in and start preparing. And one of the people that we reached out to that had been in the University of Colorado, because they were very, very familiar with the Condon report that came out of the University of Colorado years earlier.
Okay, yeah.
And so he got terribly upset that this was going on, and he called the newspaper and told them that this was happening.
Condon?
No. It was this other guy. It was a professor there that just knew all about the Condon report.
I understand.
And so I was going to have him testify all about it, and so he told somebody about it, and so they threw a big fit. The committee threw a big fit over the fact that it had been made public, and so that this fellow Eric McLeish kept getting in there trying to get it settled. And it turns out this Eric McLeish is later on after they stopped and left John alone. I was the one that initiated the first litigation against the Catholic Church for the pedophile priests in Boston, and I got a hold of Eric McLeish to do the case for us, right?
Pull that mic back.
And he ended up settling all these cases. He was the guy in Spotlight, the movie Spotlight that Mark Ruffalo was in, where they told all about the Boston Globe in the investigation they conducted about all the priests, and they discovered that this guy Eric McLeish was the guy settling all the cases for the Catholic Church and getting a huge portion of the settlement that was given to the people, but making them sign statements that they would keep completely secret any of the accusation they made against the church, which totally pissed me off,
So was he working as a double agent with the church?
Yeah, he was. That's what he was doing.
God.
Yeah, he was settling all the cases, and he was basically engaging in covering for the church, but getting money for all the people that had filed complaints against these pedophile priests. But he was getting a share of the money. And so I was really mortified by that. But it started with him, successfully settling the case for John Mack and making them leave John alone. But it stifled our ability to bring all the witnesses on. It's a little known fact about a well-known subject. But the bottom line is that's how I ended up. After they apologized to John and left him alone, he had me become legal counsel for his project on extraordinary experience research, the peer group that he had there in Cambridge. And John and I started working on trying to set up what we were calling the New Paradigm Institute, that was going to be examining the worldviews clash that occurred, that this is an entirely different worldview that Harvard University has. It's the scientific, logical, positivist, materialist worldview, and that the assertion that it was completely impossible to believe that any spacecraft could actually come from a distant star system and come to our planet just couldn't be true. Because, they can't go faster than the speed of light, and therefore they can't get there.
What did John think about all of this? Did he really think that this was like spacecrafts coming from another star system, or did he think this was something like inside the human mind?
No, it wasn't inside the human mind. What he started thinking about was that he thought it was quite clear that there was evidence that some of these events involved a spacecraft from some other planetary system. For example, the Betty and Barney Hill case. Betty Hill actually got one of the people on the craft that she believed that they'd been abducted and brought onto to show her a map. You probably have heard about that. Showed him the star map, right? And she did get hypnotized by a guy in Boston, a professional hypnotist, and she redrew the star map that was shown to him, and nobody could figure out where it was. And it turns out that it wasn't later, until they had the computers that could do it, that they reversed the star chart to figure out the perspective from which the star map was drawn that came from their planet, which turned out to be Zeta Reticuli. And when that happened, that was kind of a further confirmation, because there wasn't any way she could have drawn something like that. She didn't know anything about stuff like that, right? And so John said, okay, now there's some solid evidence that at least some of this is coming from an extraterrestrial civilization somewhere. But he thought that there was other stuff going on as well, that it wasn't that this was a delusion on their part, but that in fact there was something going on that had to do with what is normally considered to be religion, in apparitions of that saints see, and the apparitions of Mary, that these kind of things that are happening in the, and so he started exploring it, and he going to interview indigenous people around the world who believe that they have direct encounters with star people. In the Lakota tribe, for example, the Lakota people believe that they come from the Pleiades originally, and that they came down from the Pleiades in this light chamber, came down into the Black Hills, into the wind caves, and came up through the wind caves. It's a very specific tradition that they believe. Yeah. And there are other indigenous tribes. So John started interviewing people and put together this thing called the Project on Extraordinary Experience Research. Just one of the extraordinary experiences was these encounters with what they experienced as being an extraterrestrial being, in a spacecraft. But there were other experiences that people had that made it appear that it was like interdimensional, that they thought that these beings were coming from some other dimension. In fact, John got called by Bob Bigelow out from the Skinwalker Ranch.
Right.
This is back in 1995 or so, right? And he got a call from Bigelow, and Bigelow asked John to come fly out and see him right away and bring your lawyer who helped you there at Harvard. So we flew out to see Bigelow, and when we arrived, even like a day later, after this event had taken place, we arrived and met with him, and he didn't want to talk about it anymore. He decided, I don't want to talk about it. And Colum Kelleher was there. And Colum took me aside and stepped into the room next door and told me all about what had happened there at the ranch. And it had to do with this kind of portal that was like at the ranch. And that this portal had opened, and one of their people had seen this person, a big, tall, 7-foot tall being, that had big kind of shaggy hair. It looked almost like a Yeti kind of character. And Colum told me all about it. And so I went back out and was talking to Bigelow to see whether he wanted to do it, because what happened is Bigelow brought in a scientific team right away to try to see what it is that was going on here, to measure what was. And these two helicopters flew in. And landed and ordered the scientific team to get away. And they couldn't come to where this event took place. And the scientists kept saying, no, we're here from Mr. Bigelow. He owns this place. guys, and they said they don't care. Get the hell out of here. They were American guys.
Black helicopters?
They were unmarked helicopters, but they were just regular jumpsuits, all black jumpsuits, no insignia on them, no names on them and anything. But they were American guys talking. He knew that they could recognize they were American military guys, And when the scientists kept trying to insist upon going in and setting up their equipment, they began to get beaten up by these guys and breaking their equipment and broke their cameras and scared the crap out of them.
On Skinwalker Ranch?
Yes, yeah, and I was right there, like within 2 days of when this happened, of them beating up the scientists and stuff, and so that originally he was so upset that Bigelow wanted to sue them and wanted John to bring his lawyer out to do something about this, but by the time we got there, just a couple of days later, he just was not going to do anything at all. And as I say, it was Colin Colliher told me all about the details of what it is that had just happened.
Who do you guys suspect these people were?
I don't get paid to guess. If people want to investigate it and want to do it so I can retain professional investigators and the proper people to do the investigation, we do it.
Does anybody have any ideas? Does Bigelow have any clue? Does anybody speculate?
All kinds of people speculate. I mean,
what do people say?
This whole field is filled with speculation.
These private contractors, are they?
It's that I'm assuming that I'll be in position, since we've set up the new institute, the new Paradigm Institute, that will be funded to investigate things like this and do it professionally, full scale, with psychological stress evaluators and professional investigators that are licensed gun toters.